Welcome to another episode of the Some Engineering Podcast. Today we have Julia Schottenstein. Julia is a product lead at DBT Labs, and DBT Labs' core product is DBT Core. So we're going to talk about how engineering practices have found their way into working with data and analytics engineering. And Julia, welcome. Let's dive right in. Let's talk a little bit about your role. What is DBT? What do you guys do?
Lars, so good to be here. So for those that don't know about DBT, it's a really popular open source framework. It's really a language that helps people describe their data for their business needs. So when data arrives in your warehouse, it comes in its raw form, whether it's coming from your production application or coming in from Stripe or Salesforce. You have all these different sources, and it lands in your warehouse in its raw state. And usually that's not that useful for your business. So what you have to do is you have to prepare it, clean it, join it, transform that data so that it matches what you actually need for your business, either for observability or analysis, or maybe it pipes into some machine learning model or what have you. It needs a lot of work to get into that final usable state. And so what DBT does is it's a framework to help what we call analytics engineers take messy data and make it useful for their business. And it runs right in your warehouse. So if you are on a cloud warehouse, DBT is a great tool for you to get your business data useful.
And we've known each other for quite some while, and for us, analytics engineering is an established practice, right? But not everyone, for everyone out there, it's not obvious quite yet. So DBT really got big, sort of riding on the trends of cloud warehouses, BigQuery, Snowflake, Redshift, and then you are now the transformation layer within that warehouse when my raw data arrives. Can you talk a little bit about like what exactly are the components of DBT when that happens?
Yeah. So DBT, it really takes a lot of like best practices from software engineering. So we believe that if you're going to create clean, prepared data tables in your warehouse, you have to have a good process and framework in place. So at the center of it, we have version control. So that way you can have versioned code. So you don't introduce mistakes, or if you do, you can roll them back easily. There's tests around it, so you can make sure that your data is coming in the shape that you expect. You can write custom tests, uniqueness tests, whatever you'd like, and documentation alongside your DBT framework, so you actually know what you're looking at, and other people can contribute easily to your DBT project. But at its core, it's a transpiler. So we send instructions to your warehouse to actually materialize the tables as you've described in your DBT code. And we really like these concepts of modular code. What often happens in data, if you're not using DBT, is you'll have lots of people on your team describe the same exact logic in 10 different ways. And so it's not very repeatable. And that's exactly what you don't want to have happen. You want to have a source of truth, of accuracy, of this is how I define my business metric, lifetime value or CAC or net revenue retention. You want to describe that alongside your DBT project, and you want to define it once and use it everywhere. So DBT is really that standardization across your organization of how you have clean, prepared tables that everyone can read from and rely on. They know they're accurate.
And in the run-up to this episode, you mentioned a concept that I thought really interesting, that I think is really interesting, and it's data as a durable asset. So I think anyone today, it's easy to spin up a data pipeline. It's easy to spin up a data warehouse, pump some data in, write some SQL queries, and create a dashboard. I think that's, that problem is solved. But as you said, 10 people come in and do it 10 different ways, and you have the same metric with 10 different values. So can you talk a little bit about the concept of data as a durable asset? What's the philosophy behind it, and how do you get there?
Yeah. I think a lot of people talk about it also as data as product. And it's this new, really principles around how do we treat our data such that it's not something that you write once and throw away. And that's a really hard thing. Like when you, if your listeners are really software engineers, like building software is actually not the hardest part of doing the thing. It's
Yeah.
you have to maintain it, you have to scale it, you have to do all of these things to make sure that the health of your software product is has longevity and is reliable. Well, the same thing is true of data products because they are, you have new data coming in all the time. You can have data that doesn't show up. You can have um, bad data. You can have logic that changes. You have different ways to use that data. So you have to treat it as a durable asset that people can really rely on. And so there are certain like processes that are requirements or prerequisites to having data as a product. We talked about a couple of them, which is normal software engineering practices like version control, documentation, testing, CI. These are all things to help you get the data assets created. But then the hard part is often the maintaining and improving upon them. And so data sources, they're messy, they're coming from lots of different places. You have to have kind of agreements of when the data will show up, what form they'll show up in, and then observability and alerting so that inevitably when something does go wrong, which it always does, you have good information really quickly about what was the source of the problem and how to go fix it.
Hmm. And when your users and customers come to you, um, what is sort of the first? What is what is the first step in realizing that they have to treat data as an asset? Like, what is sort of the shift in the mindset you observe with them?
Yeah. So a very common thing for people to do is describe a lot of their business logic really coupled into their BI tool. So lots of BI tools have their own semantic
Yeah,
layer or they have their own logic layer. A really popular one is LookML of Looker.
yeah.
And if you have lots of people having to describe that logic once in Looker, maybe you describe it again. Your finance team has to describe some other business logic because they don't use Looker, they're using Excel spreadsheets. Or maybe in Salesforce, you have some other custom analysis that you're writing once again. You end up having this fragmented sprawl of people writing lots of SQL queries over and over again to do the same thing. And so the better practice is to realize, well, what are my most common tables that are really important for our business and have a centralized, high production way of creating these tables so that everyone can agree that they're accurate, that you know that they're right, and then instead of putting the analysis in 10 different places, have it centralized in DBT. It's a version control, tested, peer reviewed, all these great things, and then you just consume it in all of the destinations.
Hmm. And so this, I think in one of your blog posts you wrote, or you quoted someone else. What was it? Uh, Data engineers are just pissed off business analysts.
Yeah, data analysts.
Data
I like
analysts,
that
right?
quote.
Yeah, yeah. It's so true, right? Because you have people who want to work with data, but there's so many hurdles to get to that data. And so they roll up the sleeves and start writing, data pipelines themselves. And so so how like what is so on that skill set, what is the skill set you see that I guess it's the analytics engineer, but coming from the from the business analysis side, what is the skill set? Like, what's the evolution you see with these people, that the skills they acquire to work with data and by applying software engineering principles to working with data? Like, what's the journey you see them
Yeah.
do?
Well, I think it's interesting to hear the story of like, well, what was it like before DBT and what is the world today? Like, who are we solving for? And I think the challenge that we saw in people who haven't adopted or DBT or before it existed was you had two different teams that were required to do the analysis work. So your data analyst is trying to work with the business units, you're working with your sales team, trying to give them the information that they need to be successful at their jobs. But often the prerequisite for any good analysis is clean, prepared data tables that you can read from to do that analysis. So what would happen is you'd have this kind of bottleneck where you'd have to work with your data engineering team to make sure the data was prepared, that you had a pipeline in there, that it was arriving on time. And that could take a serious, weeks, take time, and it was a frustrating experience. Maybe it wasn't done exactly right. So you have a game of telephone back and forth, all before you can get your work done. And so that's where the frustration really stemmed from. And that's why I like the quote that
Yeah.
analytics engineers are just pissed off data analysts, because, they wanted to really earn the right to be able to create production tables themselves in their warehouse. And I say earn the right because, just like, in software, you can't just, push to prod without proper checks and controls in place. It's the same thing with data assets. You have to treat them carefully because a lot of people rely on them, and it is something that you have to earn. And so that's what DBT enabled for people, was the right framework and processes in place where you knew that more people could contribute to the data pipelining work, and it would be accurate. And so the real kind of change that we introduced into the world was, this data pipelining shouldn't be so hard. You don't have to know so many things to be able to contribute. How do we simplify it, create the right guardrails in place so that more people can participate in this work, so that your whole company could have higher velocity?
And so the way DBT does that today, I think of DBT as two separate products, and there's more products probably below that, but there's DBT Core, and then there's DBT Cloud. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between those two products? Like, what do I get with the cloud, and when is
Yeah.
it a good time to go from core to cloud?
Yeah. So core is it's the language, it's the framework, it's how you describe your business logic. It's open source, and it's a standard. It will always be Apache 2 open source, because we want that to be something that our users own, right? You don't want to have vendor lock-in when you're describing this important modeling work as it relates to your, unique business. And and that comes with everything. It's the frameworks that I just mentioned around version control, testing, modular code, all the guardrails in place so that you can create these clean assets. And lots of people use core only. But to do that, you often have to build a lot of tooling around it to both develop it and also productionize it. And so throughout the entire analytics engineering workflow, very similar to the DevOps workflow, from development to testing and integrating it to shipping it and productionizing it, alerting, observability, how do you actually administer DBT? These are all things that we build on the DBT cloud application to make our companies be able to get up and running with DBT even faster, and then make them successful with less investment on their end for maintenance to actually roll this out at scale within their organization. So it's everything around the experience, collaboration that comes with the DBT cloud application.
And you mentioned a few words there, or one word specifically, which is scale. At some point, I would love to hear a few examples of how big some of these DBT environments are now, if you can share those numbers. And then the other piece that I wanted to dig in is the nerdy software or software engineering piece, or at least the practices, like the CI/CD
Yeah.
products that you have. Maybe let's cover that first, the nerdy techie part. Um, what what are some of the features or capabilities DBT offers in cloud, specifically as it comes to CI and CD pipelines?
Yeah. So we offer a purpose built CI tool, and it's purpose built for the data workflow, which would be a little bit different if you're talking about a CI tool for some software engineering pipeline. And specifically, what is so different about it is, when you have to build these pipelines, it can be pretty expensive. Data transformations can take a long time, especially if you have lots of data or your queries are complex. So what our CI product does is it makes it really easy to only test your modified code on a subset of your data, maybe in staging. So it's not working off of the production data that might be a little bit more sensitive. You can have these controls to set up the environment, so you have that flexibility. And then we defer it, is maybe it's more of a DBT specific term, but we do comparisons between what's actually running in your production warehouse versus what's coming in your pull request. and we only build the absolute minimum set of code and data to test all of those changes. And we do nice things to make it a little bit easier on your end so that it's all automated and gives people a lot of confidence that when you're contributing to your DBT project, you're not going to introduce some mistake, or it's not going to be built in an unexpected way. We create these staging environments for the customer so you can observe the data before it actually gets pushed to prod.
Yeah, I'm going back down my own memory lane, like 2016, when people started working with when they started truly adopting cloud warehouses. And I just remember how, they would just pump data into a raw data schema, into a Redshift, even or a Snowflake cluster, and start querying the raw data, and obviously analysts would start building their dashboards on top of that, and then something would change, and then the dashboards would break, right? I mean, that was
Yeah.
just a and I also think, like, back then DBT started out as a consulting.
Yep. Fishtown Analytics.
Yeah, Fishtown Analytics, which is an area in Philadelphia. Um, and so today, and I think your sweet spot in terms of customers was sort of like the Series A, Series B type of companies that kind of struggled to build their analytics stack, and that's where Fishtown Analytics came in. So is that still true I mean, not the consulting part, but like, what do you see in your customer base? What are sort of like some of the smaller environments? What are some of the bigger environments? Like, is
Yeah.
there, and can you share that? I don't know. I'd love to know.
Yeah. So I think it's very fun building product at DBT Labs because we actually have this, like, if you have a cloud warehouse, you're a good user or a good potential user of DBT. So it's a really wide scope because, yes, small Series A companies have a cloud warehouse, but also, Fortune 100 companies have cloud warehouses. And we really do run the gamut of company size in all different industries. It's very, very horizontal in nature. And you were asking before about scale and what have I seen. I mean, we see DBT deployed now in companies that have thousands of analytics engineers that
Wow.
need to contribute. And this is not just working with data, but actually contributing to data pipelines. So an enormous scale. It's a very complex administration challenge of how do you get all of these analytics engineers productive. There's a lot of security concerns. How do you make sure they're all in the same environment, that they have access to, the right things and not the wrong things? So this really becomes very difficult to deploy at scale, and that's where DBT Cloud makes these customers way more effective and successful of just even administration and the governance piece of DBT. So we really do see complex organizations being successful on DBT, but it's surprising because I think, yes, large companies have lots of data. That's likely to be true, but we also see small companies with really complex data needs, and it's not uncommon for, a 50-person startup to have massive scale of data
Yeah.
or really high requirements of needing data very, very timely, or very complex DBT DAGs and how they model and describe their business needs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you talked a little bit about code. Um, can you maybe explain a little bit what code means in the context of DBT? Because at the end of the day, I think we're talking about a SQL model that's running in a warehouse. So what's sort of the type of code you're referring to? What's that? And how does it turn into a SQL model?
Yeah. So it's really at the framework of DBT, it creates a DAG, a directed acyclic graph, where you have these modular or models that describe some finite table that's maybe your customer's table, or maybe it's an orders table, some discrete part of your business logic. And usually it's described in SQL. We just introduced Python as well, so I have to be careful to not just say only SQL because we're inviting more languages to participate in the DAG. And then around that is some configuration in YAML where you can describe some settings for your project. How do you want to materialize it? How do you write your documentation? All within your DBT code base. And what's cool about the way DBT works is it understands if it's running in dev or prod, or the cloud app understands this, so that you have isolation. So that if we're working on the same project and I'm mucking with the code base, that's going to build in my schema DBT J Schottenstein, and your schema will be separate. You'll have DBT Lars, so that we can work simultaneously and not get in each other's way. But once you merge that code, or once you're in a higher environment, staging or production, DBT knows to build it in a different target or a different environment. So you're now building to the production sets that get consumed by the business.
Great. And so we're at the end of 22, and you just had your big conference, Coalesce. Maybe switching gears to what people have done and the evolution of DBT to what it is today. Looking forward to 23, what do you see people doing? And I'm going to throw out a few terms: data products, data apps. You mentioned Python, which makes me think of data scientists, right? What are some of the trends you see, or what's coming in 23?
Oh, we're deep in planning right now, so which is always a fun time of year because we're figuring out the roadmap. So I'll talk maybe more about themes than like actual deliverables, but some of the themes that we're thinking about is how do we scale better with our organizations, both scaling development, scaling collaboration, and scaling our platform. And those are three big pillars with which we're building around, and that could come in a lot of different shapes. But it really comes back to your initial question of like, who is DBT good for, and how do we continue to grow really well with all of our users, because we have some of the most complex organizations now, like very, very deep within DBT. And so we're really thinking of building for them in mind. Some of the cool things that I've also just observed is often when you build something, you have an idea of how people will use it, but you always get sometimes pleasantly surprised and sometimes not so pleasantly surprised about how people use it. One of the cool things that we've been seeing more of is people are bringing DBT into production contexts. So we have we actually have several hundred projects that use DBT where they need to run their pipelines on frequencies of 15 minutes or faster, which to me suggests that people really care about real time and they are actually powering applications. I'll give you maybe an example of one that I love, but we have a learning management uh, software application. And the plumbing behind that application is actually DBT analytics to show completion rates of, did your employees actually watch the videos? Where did they drop off? How did they score on the test within the application? And it's all powered on DBT that's being run at near real-time speeds,
Wow.
which I think is just very exciting because now you have people with data backgrounds really showing their value of, hey, I can contribute to this revenue producing application for our business. And we've dramatically lowered the barrier of what skills are needed to contribute to this kind of work. So I think we'll see more of that.
Yeah, that's what I see. That's what I see popping up as well. Interesting, because that's sort of the future we talked about 2 or 3 years ago, and now I finally see how it's coming into play. Do you have more examples like that? Maybe some interesting things you could
Yeah, I
talk
mean,
about?
we see lots of in this specific category. I think we see a lot of interesting ones. I've seen um, conference management, so real time attendance of like who's attended very large scale conferences. There's a sports betting company that's running off of DBT analytics. There's another um, a software productivity metrics company that's looking at how, like Dora metrics, which measure how productive are your software engineers, all running off of DBT. And so we're seeing like pretty like far reaching anything that has data analytics or tracking of usage can now better be described in DBT as the durable asset or the durable logic that you can run on top of. And the warehouses too are evolving to, I mean, it really, I think, is happening for two reasons. One is we can trust the data quality better because we have the better practices in place, and we no longer have to worry quite as much because if we do have an error, we get alerted faster. And then two is the underlying uh, data platforms which power the transformations and do the actual computation. They're a lot faster and they're bridging the world of OLAP and OLTP.
Ah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. The famous caching layer on top of your data warehouse. Yeah. That's what we built back then. When we had our own dashboards running, not directly on Redshift, but we had a data app. Fascinating. So we covered a lot of ground. We covered the history of DBT, what it does, the difference between DBT core and cloud, some of the use cases. I wanted to talk about two other things: orchestration and the semantic layer. I don't know which one you want to cover first, but you said, like, for instance, you just mentioned, like, 15-minute intervals, which is, with the cloud warehouse, that's, I don't want to say pushing it, but you're getting there.
Yeah, you're pushing it.
Yeah.
Depends which warehouse you're using.
Right. Yeah. We all know which one. Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about that? Orchestration first, maybe, and then the semantic layer. Like, what are some of the things that are happening with DBT and what people are trying to do?
Yeah. So lots of people call DBT in a few ways. On the core side, you can host it yourself and decide to run it via cron schedules or plug it into a general purpose orchestrator like an Airflow. On the cloud side, we make that really easy for you because we'll set up DBT Cloud jobs that is all set up in our UI, and you can describe which commands you want, run it on a schedule if you so choose, call it via API. You have some choice there. I think in the future, there's a lot of exciting work that we could potentially do to help orchestrate more workflows within DBT. So today we just orchestrate the transformation parts, which ends up being a big meaty part of any data ETL workflow. But there are on the ends, often when your DBT DAG finishes, you want to send that data back to your warehouse, or sorry, back to Salesforce, so you can operationalize that data, or maybe you send it to your data science team that's going to run it in some fancy machine learning model, or you have another number of destinations of how the data gets used. It's not just being read from your BI tool. And same thing goes, maybe there's something in the middle of your DAG. And I'm excited about kind of extending the reach of what DBT's DAG can do to have the orchestration of more tasks besides just transformation. So we have a lot of requests for that. It's something we're thinking about, not yet committed to, but we're seeing, I think, some real innovation that needs to happen in the orchestration space more broadly. People spend a lot of time describing pipelines, trying to get their data to show up on time to create those real-time results. And I think it should be a lot simpler. And I'd love to see the orchestration industry evolve to give people the power without all of the effort.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, what, 6 years ago, how many orchestration products were there? Like Luigi, Azkaban, Airflow. Did I forget one? There's, like, I don't know, a whole bunch of them. But it's like, based on what you told me, even that layer is now within DBT, specifically within DBT Cloud, right? Because you have your own orchestration layer in there.
Yeah, a lot of it is in DBT, but not at the fringes. So what has happened is a lot of the description of describe this model and then build this next model, and then that depends on these other models. That's all described within your DBT DAG because we have this like very simple way to create those dependencies described in your DBT project. But often there's always the 99th task that's not in DBT that still needs to be orchestrated, or you still need a webhook to go call some other independent scheduler that will build some other part of the data workflow. And I think it's gotten simpler for lots of people, but there's still some work to do.
And so then going over to the semantic layer, if I were to define it, I would say giving words to metrics, assigning words to
Mm-hmm.
metrics. Um, we talked a little bit about LookML, and that's a product by now that's like 15 years old, maybe not quite, like 13. But you recently launched a product. Let's talk about that. What's DBT's semantic layer?
Yeah. So our semantic layer, it's as you said, if you're able to define your business metrics alongside your DBT project. And what makes a metric different than just a normal DBT materialized table is it actually will get computed at query time. So a lot of times you need to have different time periods for which this metric is useful. I'd like to look at my churn for the quarter, or I'd like to look at my churn for the year, or I'd like to look at um, temporal is often a very common slice that you need to see of the data, but you often don't know what your business user is going to want or ask until they ask it. And it's too expensive to pre-compute all of these things in materialized tables. So what your metrics definitions do is you define what the logic is in your DBT code, and then we have tight integrations with your BI tools, your um, data cataloging tools, so that a user, when they want to ask the question of, I'd like to cut my, churn by month. Oh, actually, I'd want it by quarter, or actually, I want it by year. You can kind of slice and dice your data at query time. And that's all powered in DBT Cloud now, because it will serve up the same results no matter who's asking the question.
Got it. Okay. And what's the and I always come back to the people. So what's the mindset, or what is this your users, what is sort of the revelation they need to have? Like, what's the mindset they need to have to understand how this really works and what the purpose is and how it's useful? Have you
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think people grok that pretty quickly. If you've ever used a BI tool that doesn't have a semantic layer, you end up in the state where a lot of people are defining the same queries slightly differently over and over and over again. And actually, I personally don't think that it should be a requirement that all business users need to understand SQL to be able to get answers of their data. And so if you don't have this predefined way to define your metrics and then slice and dice it however you need at query time, it's a lot harder for your business users to consume the data without needing support. Or if they try to do it on their own, they might, define things slightly differently every single time. So that pain, I think, is really felt at any scale of a business, where it can get pretty inconsistent very, very quickly. I think the new thing that's happening with the semantic layer is who owns it, or where is it described, that's different in the industry. Previously, it was very tightly coupled with your BI tool, which made sense because that was primarily where you consumed that data, was in your dashboards and in your visualization layer. But as we talked about just a minute ago, that data is now finding many different destinations of where it's useful. And it would be beneficial to change the abstraction of where that business logic gets defined and have it more tightly coupled to where the data sits in your actual warehouse, and describe it with the rest of your business logic in DBT. So that way it can be consumed not just by your BI tool, but also your data catalog, your data applications, your data science notebooks, and any other number of destinations that become important to read from the same business metrics. So that's the real shift. And it's new to the industry. I think the if there's hesitation on will this work, or when will this be more mainstream, it's really a kind of a catch 22, because for the users, the semantic layer is only as useful as there are enough vendors that want to integrate with that semantic layer so that you can consume your business metrics. And for the vendors to do that work of integration, it's actually, they have to get it on their roadmaps, devote some resources to it in engineering. They have to see the demand. And I think we're at a point now where enough people are using DBT. We have over 16,000 companies actively using DBT every week, that we have the scale to kind of lend our weight and say, yes, this is important. The vendors are getting on board, the users are on board, and the flywheel is starting to spin.
So, Julia, you mentioned vendors and destinations. And again, going back in time, 5 years ago, what I saw in the stack was usually a mix of 4 or 5 tools. It was Fivetran, it was Segment, Fivetran for SaaS data, Segment for event data. There was a data warehouse, obviously, Snowflake, BigQuery, Redshift. There was DBT at the core of it. That was everywhere. And then a dashboard like Tableau or Metabase. And that was really it. And, Airflow was in there too. So what does that look like today? What are sort of like the tool and vendor ecosystem that has been created around DBT?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know if the vendor ecosystem has been created around DBT or that we've just evolved with it. One of the cool parts of the modern data stack is there's first it's cloud, but it's also very composable, so the components are very interoperable. And that list of vendors that you mentioned, they're very similar. We see obviously the data platforms. They're a handful that really matter. There's a longer tail of more specialized vendors as well. If you need real time or streaming that are coming into play as well. Um, you have a couple more players on the EL space to help move the data from your sources to the destination of your data platform. Really, on the logic layer, DBT has become the standard. There's obviously the orchestration tools, which we mentioned as well. And then I think the interesting part is the BI landscape is probably the one that's evolving the most. Um, there's obviously been the two dominant ones, Looker and Tableau, were both acquired. Um, that does change the landscape a bit. They're still extraordinarily popular and loved by their users, but there's definitely more opportunity for newer players in the BI space, and it's always been a bit more fragmented at that layer. One, it's a enormous market, so there's a big pie to go after. Lots of people are interested in that, and then you also get fragmentation because user preference and choice matter so much at that layer. Whereas when you go lower in the stack and you have more of like the picks and shovels, you end up
Yeah.
having more of kind of centralization around a few standards that really matter, and people build onto those platforms. Whereas when you go higher in the stack, you do have fragmentation because it's user choice and business choice of what people like. Do you like a BI tool that's similar to a spreadsheet? Then check out Sigma. Do you like something that has logic deeply integrated into it? Check out a Looker. Something maybe more modern, check out Hex, Metabase. Uh, you end up just having a longer tail of players in that category.
Yeah. Yeah. And then as the closing question, you actually touched on one company that uses DBT as part of their stack to calculate DORA metrics, which is a very DevOps centric term. And that also means they acquire a different type of data set than, I would say if there's such a thing like the average DBT customer needs, which is like Salesforce data, marketing data, Stripe data. Do you see the volume or the diversity of data sources expanding? Is there different types of data sources that are coming in? Is there a trend you can observe, or is it too early
Yeah.
to tell? Yeah.
Well, I don't know ever like what specifically the sources are that people are using. We just don't have that visibility. But I could say that you look at Five Trainer or Airbyte as a proxy of the kinds of data that people care about bringing into your warehouse and the number of connectors that they have to support and how that's ballooned over the years and doesn't seem to slow. Yes, there's an enormous trend still to get as much data as possible that's useful to your business, centralized in your data platform, in your warehouse or lakehouse, so that you can use it for your as a business advantage. And I think we'll just continue to see a whole lot more of that.
Yeah. So it's almost like it's still day one in data. It's
Always day one,
always
always
day one.
evolving, keeps it fun.
Yeah, yeah. Julia, this was awesome. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
Lars, thanks for having me. This
Yeah,
was fun.
Julia Schottenstein, product lead at DBT. Thank you so much.
Thank you.